Colonel David Lones pressed his binoculars against the observation post window, scanning the mist-shrouded hills surrounding Sanh Combat Base. It was January 21st, 1968, and something felt terribly wrong in the pre-dawn darkness. The usual symphony of jungle sounds had fallen silent, replaced by an ominous quiet that made the hair on his neck stand on end. Intelligence reports had been flooding in for weeks about massive North Vietnamese army movements in the area, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. The remote Marine base, perched on a plateau just 14 miles south of the demilitarized zone, had become the focal point of what would prove to be one of the most psychologically devastating sieges in American military history. General von Nguyen Giap, the mastermind behind the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier, had chosen this isolated outpost for reasons that would soon become terrifyingly clear. The parallels to the earlier French disaster were not lost on American military leadership, who watched with growing anxiety as thousands of North Vietnamese troops began encircling the base. At exactly 5:30 that morning, the earth beneath Sanh erupted in a thunderous crescendo of incoming artillery and rocket fire. The opening barrage struck with such intensity that Marines later described it as hell unleashing itself upon Earth. Ammunition dumps exploded in massive fireballs that could be seen for miles, sending shockwaves through the base that knocked men off their feet and shattered windows and bunkers thought to be secure. The siege of Sanh had begun, and with it, a 7 to 7 day ordeal that would fundamentally alter American strategy in Southeast Asia. President Lyndon Johnson paced the floors of the White House Situation Room, his weathered face etched with concern as reports streamed in from the beleaguered base. The specter of another Dien Bien Phu haunted every conversation, every strategic meeting, every sleepless night that followed. Johnson had ordered a scale model of Sanh constructed in the White House basement, where he would spend hours studying every hill, every bunker, every possible avenue of approach that the enemy might use. The president's obsession with the siege would consume his final months in office and contribute to his decision not to seek re-election. The strategic importance of Sanh lay not merely in its geographic position, but in what it represented to both sides of the conflict. For the Americans, it was a critical observation post overlooking the Ho Chi Minh Trail and a launching point for operations into Laos. For the North Vietnamese, it was an opportunity to recreate their greatest victory against Western forces and potentially break American will to continue the war. General William Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, had convinced himself that Giap was attempting to replicate Dien Bien Phu, unaware that the siege was actually an elaborate diversion for the upcoming Tet Offensive. As dawn broke over the scarred landscape surrounding Sanh, the 6,000 Marines and South Vietnamese Rangers trapped within the base perimeter began to comprehend the magnitude of their predicament. Intelligence estimates suggested they were surrounded by somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 North Vietnamese troops equipped with heavy artillery, rockets, and anti-aircraft weapons that had been painstakingly moved into position over months of preparation. The siege would test not only the courage and endurance of the defenders, but also the resolve of a nation increasingly divided over its involvement in Vietnam. The second week of the siege brought a grim routine to life at Sanh Combat Base. Each morning began with the distant whistle of incoming rockets, followed by the thunderous explosions that had become as regular as sunrise. Staff Sergeant Michael Archer crouched in his bunker, methodically cleaning his M16 rifle while listening to the familiar sounds of destruction. Above, the Marines had learned to distinguish between different types of incoming fire by sound alone: the sharp crack of mortars, the deeper whoosh of rockets, and the earth-shaking impact of long-range artillery fired from guns hidden in the caves of Ko Rock Mountain across the border in Laos. General Giap's strategy was becoming increasingly clear to American intelligence analysts. The North Vietnamese commander had positioned his forces with meticulous precision, using the same tactics that had proven so effective against the French at Dien Bien Phu. Heavy artillery pieces were concealed in caves and reverse slope positions that made them nearly impossible to locate and destroy from the air. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the base at strategic intervals, creating a deadly gauntlet for supply aircraft and medical evacuation helicopters. Most ominously, North Vietnamese engineers had begun digging an elaborate network of trenches and tunnels that crept closer to the American perimeter with each passing day. The psychological warfare component of the siege proved equally devastating. North Vietnamese loudspeakers, positioned just beyond rifle range, broadcast propaganda messages in English throughout the night. "Marines, you are surrounded and cut off from all help," the voices would taunt. "Your families back home are protesting against this war. Why do you fight for a government that doesn't want you here?" The constant psychological pressure, combined with the physical strain of living under near-constant bombardment, began to take its toll on even the most hardened veterans. Supply became a critical issue as the siege entered its third week. The base's single runway had been damaged so severely by incoming fire that it could no longer accommodate transport aircraft. All supplies had to be delivered by helicopter or airdropped from high altitude to avoid the deadly anti-aircraft fire. Medical supplies ran dangerously low, and several Marines died from wounds that would have been survivable under normal circumstances. The stench of crude, diesel fuel, and human waste permeated every corner of the base, creating living conditions that bordered on unbearable. According to declassified Pentagon documents, later revealed in the Washington Post's comprehensive coverage of the siege, President Johnson's obsession with Sanh reached almost pathological levels during this period. He demanded hourly upgrades on the tactical situation and ordered his military advisors to provide him with detailed assessments of the base's defensive capabilities. The president even went so far as to require written assurances from the Joint Chiefs of Staff that Sanh would not fall, fearing that such a defeat would destroy his presidency and America's credibility in Southeast Asia. The Marines defending Sanh adapted to their circumstances with the resilience that had become their hallmark. They constructed elaborate underground bunker systems, some extending 30 feet below ground level, connected by tunnels that allowed movement between positions without exposure to enemy fire. The base took on the appearance of a lunar landscape, cratered by thousands of shell impacts and littered with the debris of war. Yet somehow, through a combination of determination, superior firepower, and sheer bloody-mindedness, the defenders held their ground against overwhelming odds. Captain Mirza Ali Khan, a Pakistani military observer attached to the American forces, later wrote in his memoirs about the extraordinary courage he witnessed during those dark February days. The Marines at Sanh, he noted, displayed a level of determination that bordered on the supernatural. Despite being outnumbered by at least 3-1 and subjected to continuous bombardment, they maintained their fighting spirit and never wavered in their commitment to holding the base. The thunder of B-52 Stratofortresses passing overhead at 30,000 feet became the soundtrack of salvation for the besieged Marines at Sanh. Operation Niagara, the massive air campaign launched to support the base, represented the most concentrated application of American air power since the Second World War. General Westmoreland had committed virtually every available aircraft in theater to the defense of Sanh, from the massive strategic bombers to tiny forward air control aircraft that dared to fly at treetop level to mark targets for the fighter bombers that followed. The statistics of Operation Niagara were staggering in their scope and intensity. Over the course of the 7-day siege, American aircraft flew more than 24,000 sorties and dropped over 100,000 tons of ordnance on North Vietnamese positions surrounding the base. The B-52s alone dropped nearly 60,000 tons of bombs, creating a carpet of devastation that extended for miles in every direction. Arc-light missions, as the B-52 strikes were codenamed, arrived with clockwork precision every 3 hours, their massive bomb loads creating seismic tremors that could be felt miles away from the impact zones. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Pike, an Air Force forward air controller call sign L65, flew daily missions in his tiny Cessna Odu aircraft, diving through walls of anti-aircraft fire to mark targets for the fighters and bombers that followed. Pike's aircraft was hit by ground fire 17 times during the siege, but he continued to fly, knowing that the Marines below depended on accurate air strikes for their survival. Flying over Sanh was like flying into the mouth of hell, Pike later recalled. The entire countryside around the base looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and smoking from continuous bombardment. The North Vietnamese had prepared extensively for the American air campaign, constructing elaborate underground bunker systems and moving their heavy weapons into caves that provided natural protection from even the largest bombs. Their anti-aircraft defenses were formidable, consisting of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, heavy machine guns, and automatic cannons positioned at multiple elevations around the base. American aircraft losses mounted steadily throughout the siege, with several dozen fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters shot down by the concentrated enemy fire. Despite the massive firepower being brought to bear against them, the North Vietnamese continued their relentless pressure on the Marine perimeter. Their trenches crept steadily closer to the bases, outer defenses, sometimes advancing several yards per night despite the continuous bombing. Engineers working under cover of darkness would repair damaged positions, replace destroyed weapons, and extend their tunnel systems deeper into the surrounding hills. The resilience and determination of the North Vietnamese forces impressed even their enemies, who grudgingly acknowledged the skill and courage of their opponents. The psychological impact of Operation Niagara extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation at Khe Sanh. The massive commitment of air power to defend a single isolated base demonstrated to the world the lengths to which America was willing to go to avoid defeat in Vietnam. Critics argued that the concentration of resources at Khe Sanh was exactly what General Giap had hoped to achieve, tying down enormous American forces and resources, while his main strength prepared for the Tet Offensive that would strike targets throughout South Vietnam. The strain on American air assets became evident as the siege continued into its second month. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft operational, often performing repairs under combat conditions at forward bases within range of enemy artillery. Pilot fatigue became a serious concern as aircrews flew multiple missions per day, pushing both men and machines to their operational limits. Several aircraft were lost due to mechanical failures exacerbated by the intensive operational tempo, adding to the growing cost of defending the isolated Marine base. Weather also played a crucial role in the air campaign's effectiveness. The monsoon season brought low clouds and poor visibility that often prevented airstrikes for days at a time. During these periods, the Marines at Khe Sanh felt truly isolated, cut off from the air support that had become their lifeline. The North Vietnamese, recognizing these opportunities, would intensify their attacks during periods of poor weather, knowing that American air power could not intervene effectively to support the defenders. On January 30th, 1968, while the world's attention remained focused on the besieged Marines at Khe Sanh, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks against more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, as it came to be known, revealed the true strategic purpose behind the siege of Khe Sanh. General Giap had masterfully orchestrated one of military history's most successful diversions, using the isolated Marine base as bait to draw American attention and resources away from the real targets of his campaign. The timing of the Tet Offensive caught American and South Vietnamese forces completely off guard. While General Westmoreland had positioned the full divisions and supporting units around Khe Sanh to counter what he believed was Giap's main effort, the real blow fell on Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and dozens of other urban centers where security was light and defenses were unprepared. Colonel Lones received word of the Tet attacks while huddled in his command bunker during a particularly heavy bombardment. The irony was not lost on him. While his Marines were fighting for their lives against what appeared to be the enemy's main force, the real battle was being fought hundreds of miles away in the cities and towns of South Vietnam. The siege of Khe Sanh, which had consumed so much attention and resources, was revealed as an elaborate feint designed to mask Giap's true intentions. The strategic implications of this revelation were staggering for American military leadership. General Westmoreland had been outmaneuvered by an opponent he had consistently underestimated, falling into a trap that any student of military history should have recognized. The concentration of forces around Khe Sanh had left other areas vulnerable to attack, exactly as Giap had intended. The North Vietnamese commander has successfully replicated one of the oldest stratagems in warfare, the diversionary attack that draws the enemy's reserves away from the real point of decision. President Johnson's reaction to the Tet Offensive was one of profound shock and disillusionment. The man who had spent countless hours studying maps of Khe Sanh and demanding assurances that the base would not fall, suddenly realized that he had been focused on the wrong battle entirely. The images of fighting in Saigon, broadcast into American living rooms by television news crews, had a far greater impact on public opinion than any tactical defeat at a remote Marine base ever could have achieved. The president's credibility, already damaged by years of optimistic pronouncements about progress in Vietnam, suffered what would prove to be a fatal blow. The Marines at Khe Sanh continued to endure their ordeal, unaware that their suffering had served the enemy's strategic purposes so effectively. The bombardment continued with unrelenting intensity, and North Vietnamese ground attacks probed the perimeter defenses on a nightly basis. Several outposts fell to determined enemy assaults, forcing the defenders to contract their perimeter and abandon positions they had held. Since the siege began, the psychological pressure of knowing they were surrounded and outnumbered, combined with the realization that their sacrifice was part of an enemy deception, took a heavy toll on morale. Intelligence analysis conducted after the Tet Offensive revealed the sophisticated nature of Giap's deception plan. Intercepted communications showed that North Vietnamese commanders had been ordered to maintain the pressure at Khe Sanh regardless of casualties, with the specific goal of keeping American attention focused on the base. The elaborate trench systems and tunnel networks surrounding Khe Sanh were designed not for a final assault on the base, but to create the impression of an impending attack that would never actually materialize. The North Vietnamese had invested heavily in this deception, committing significant resources to maintain the illusion that Khe Sanh was their primary objective. The revelation of the Tet Offensive's true relationship to the Khe Sanh siege marked a turning point in American strategic thinking about the Vietnam War. Military leaders began to question fundamental assumptions about enemy intentions and capabilities. Recognizing that they had been consistently outfought by opponents they had dismissed as unsophisticated guerrillas, the siege of Khe Sanh would continue for another 6 weeks. But its strategic significance had already been overshadowed by events elsewhere in South Vietnam. As February turned to March, the siege of Khe Sanh entered its most brutal phase. The initial shock of the bombardment had given way to a grinding war of attrition that tested the limits of human endurance. Staff Sergeant Michael Archer had lost 30 pounds since the siege began, his uniform hanging loose on his gaunt frame as he made his daily rounds of the defensive positions. The constant stress of incoming fire, combined with inadequate food and sleep, had transformed the once robust Marines into hollow-eyed survivors who moved with the mechanical precision of men pushed beyond normal human limits. The North Vietnamese had refined their tactics throughout the siege, learning to time their attacks for maximum psychological effect. Mortars and rockets would arrive just as the Marines were attempting to eat their meager rations, forcing them to abandon hot meals for the dubious safety of their bunkers. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, as incoming fire arrived at irregular intervals designed to prevent the defenders from establishing any kind of routine. The enemy's psychological warfare had evolved beyond simple propaganda broadcasts to include a sophisticated understanding of how to break down human resistance. Through carefully orchestrated stress, medical conditions at the base deteriorated rapidly as the siege entered its 7th week. Dr. Navy Lieutenant Commander Richard Steinberg, the base's senior medical officer, struggled to treat casualties with dwindling supplies and primitive facilities. Shrapnel wounds that should have been routine became life-threatening when infection set in due to unsanitary conditions and lack of proper antibiotics. Several Marines died from diseases that would have been easily treatable under normal circumstances, their deaths adding to the growing sense of desperation that permeated the base. The daily helicopter resupply missions became increasingly dangerous as North Vietnamese gunners refined their techniques and concentrated their anti-aircraft fire on the landing zones. Marine helicopter pilots, flying their CH-46 Sea Knights and U-34 Seahorses through walls of ground fire, displayed extraordinary courage in keeping the base supplied with ammunition and medical supplies. Many of these aircraft returned to their bases riddled with bullet holes, and several were shot down during their approach to Khe Sanh's makeshift landing zones. Communication with the outside world became sporadic, as North Vietnamese artillery targeted the base's radio antennas and communication facilities. Colonel Lone found himself increasingly isolated, unable to coordinate effectively with higher headquarters or call for immediate fire support when needed. The fog of war that surrounded Khe Sanh was both literal and figurative, as monsoon weather combined with enemy action to create an environment where tactical decisions had to be made with incomplete and often outdated information. The Marines adapted to their circumstances with the ingenuity that had characterized their corps. Throughout its history, they constructed elaborate drainage systems to deal with the monsoon rains that flooded their bunkers, rigged communication systems using abandoned telephone wire, and developed techniques for moving between positions without exposure to enemy observation. The base took on the appearance of an underground city, with tunnels connecting defensive positions and supply areas in a network that grew more complex. With each passing day, living conditions in the bunkers were almost unbearable. The combination of diesel fumes from generators, human waste, rotting food, and cordite from weapons fire created an atmosphere that burned the lungs and brought tears to the eyes. Rats thrived in the underground environment, growing fat on abandoned rations and creating another health hazard for the already stressed defenders. Many Marines developed respiratory problems that would plague them for years after the siege ended, a consequence of breathing the toxic air in their underground shelters. The North Vietnamese maintained their pressure through constant probing attacks and harassment fire. never allowing the defenders a moment's peace. Small unit actions along the perimeter became nightly occurrences, with enemy sappers attempting to breach the wire obstacles and infiltrate the base. These attacks were usually repelled, but they served their purpose of keeping the Marines in a constant state of alert and preventing them from getting the rest they desperately needed. The enemy understood that exhaustion was as effective a weapon as artillery in breaking down the defenders' will to resist. Despite the horrific conditions and constant danger, incidents of individual heroism were commonplace among the Marines at Sanh. Corpsmen risked their lives daily to treat wounded comrades under fire, while riflemen volunteered for dangerous patrol missions to gather intelligence on enemy positions. The siege had forged bonds between the defenders that transcended normal military relationships, creating a brotherhood born of shared suffering and mutual dependence that would last long after the guns fell silent. In the corridors of the Pentagon, a momentous debate was taking place that would determine the fate of Sanh and potentially alter the course of the Vietnam War. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, his hair now noticeably grayer than when the siege began, sat across from the Joint Chiefs of Staff as they grappled with an unthinkable question. Should the United States abandon Sanh combat base? The discussion, classified at the highest levels, represented a fundamental shift in American strategic thinking about the war in Southeast Asia. General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, presented the stark realities facing military planners. The siege had consumed enormous resources, millions of dollars in ordnance, dozens of aircraft, and the focused attention of two full divisions that could have been employed elsewhere in South Vietnam. Intelligence estimates suggested that the North Vietnamese were prepared to maintain their siege indefinitely, having constructed supply lines and defensive positions that could sustain their forces through the monsoon season and beyond. The strategic question was no longer whether Sanh could be held, but whether holding it served any useful purpose. The debate within the highest levels of government reflected deeper concerns about American strategy in Vietnam following the Tet Offensive. President Johnson, now a lame duck who had announced he would not seek re-election, was increasingly isolated and bitter about what he saw as military and intelligence failures that had led to the current crisis. The man who had once demanded hourly updates on Sanh's status now questioned whether the base had ever been worth defending in the first place. The psychological impact of being outmaneuvered by General Giap had shaken Johnson's confidence in his military advisors and contributed to his decision to step down from the presidency. At Sanh itself, the Marines remained unaware of the high-level discussions about their fate. Colonel Lones continued to plan for the base's defense, working with his staff to improve fortifications and maintain morale among his increasingly desperate garrison. The irony was palpable. While politicians and generals debated abandoning the base, the men defending it continued to fight and die for ground that their leaders were preparing to surrender voluntarily. The disconnect between policymakers in Washington and the Marines in their bunkers epitomized the broader problems plaguing American strategy in Vietnam. The decision to abandon Sanh was ultimately driven by practical, rather than strategic considerations. General Creighton Abrams, who had replaced Westmoreland as commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, brought a different perspective to the problem. Abrams recognized that Sanh had become a symbol rather than a strategic asset, consuming resources out of proportion to its tactical value. The base's remote location and vulnerability to enemy fire made it unsuitable as a permanent installation, while its symbolic importance to both sides had transformed it into a political liability rather than a military advantage. The planning for Operation Niagara Falls, the evacuation of Sanh, began in the utmost secrecy during the final weeks of the siege. Military planners faced the challenge of withdrawing a full regiment of Marines, along with their equipment and supplies, while maintaining the deception that the base would continue to be defended. The operation required careful coordination between ground forces, helicopter units, and fixed-wing aircraft to ensure that the evacuation could be completed before North Vietnamese forces recognized what was happening and launched a final assault. The psychological impact of the abandonment decision extended far beyond the military sphere. Critics of the war seized upon the evacuation as evidence that the entire Vietnam enterprise was fundamentally flawed, arguing that if a base defended at such enormous cost could be casually abandoned, then no American commitment in Southeast Asia was permanent or meaningful. Supporters of the war effort struggled to explain why so many resources had been expended defending a position that was ultimately deemed unnecessary, contributing to the growing credibility gap between government statements and battlefield realities. For the Marines, who had endured the 7-day siege, news of the evacuation came as a profound shock. Men who had risked their lives daily to hold their positions, who had watched friends die in defense of supposedly vital ground, now learned that their sacrifice had been rendered meaningless by strategic decisions made thousands of miles away. The sense of betrayal was palpable among the survivors, many of whom would carry psychological scars from their Sanh experience for the rest of their lives. The final weeks of the siege took on a surreal quality as North Vietnamese pressure mysteriously decreased. Intelligence analysts later determined that Giap had begun withdrawing his forces from around Sanh as early as mid-March, having accomplished his strategic objectives through the successful diversion that enabled the Tet offensive. The elaborate siege works that had taken months to construct were gradually abandoned as North Vietnamese units moved to other areas of operations, leaving behind empty trenches and tunnels as monuments to one of the war's most successful deception operations. On July 5, 1968, the last American troops departed Sanh combat base, ending one of the most controversial episodes in United States military history. The evacuation, designated Operation Charlie, proceeded without significant enemy interference, as North Vietnamese forces had long since departed the area for operations elsewhere in South Vietnam. Within hours of the American withdrawal, B-52 bombers destroyed the base's facilities to prevent their use by enemy forces, completing the transformation of Sanh from a symbol of American determination into a monument to strategic miscalculation. The immediate aftermath of the siege saw a fundamental reassessment of American military strategy in Vietnam. General Abrams implemented sweeping changes that moved away from the large unit operations and static defensive positions that had characterized the Westmoreland era. The new strategy, dubbed Clear and Hold, emphasized smaller unit actions, closer cooperation with South Vietnamese forces, and a focus on protecting the population rather than holding remote outposts of questionable strategic value. Sanh became the textbook example of what not to do in counterinsurgency warfare. The psychological impact of Sanh extended far beyond military circles, contributing to a growing sense of disillusionment with the Vietnam War among the American public. Television coverage of the siege had brought the brutality and futility of the conflict into American living rooms with unprecedented immediacy, while the subsequent evacuation of the base raised fundamental questions about the competence and honesty of military and political leadership. The siege became a symbol of America's failure to understand the nature of the war it was fighting in Southeast Asia. For the Marines who survived the 7-day ordeal, the legacy of Sanh was deeply personal and often traumatic. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, struggling to readjust to civilian life after experiencing the extreme stress of prolonged combat. The Veterans Administration was unprepared to deal with the psychological casualties of Vietnam, and many Sanh veterans found themselves abandoned by the same government that had sent them to defend the remote base. Support groups formed by the survivors became some of the first organized efforts to address combat trauma in returning veterans. The North Vietnamese victory at Sanh, though achieved through strategic deception rather than direct military action, demonstrated the effectiveness of patient, long-term planning against an opponent focused on short-term tactical gains. General Giap's masterful use of the siege as a diversion for the Tet Offensive became a case study in military schools around the world, illustrating how a weaker force could achieve strategic objectives through superior planning and understanding of the enemy's psychological vulnerabilities. The siege proved that military technology and firepower were insufficient substitutes for strategic thinking and cultural understanding. The political ramifications of Sanh continued to reverberate long after the base was abandoned. President Johnson's obsession with the siege and his subsequent disillusionment contributed to his decision not to seek re-election, effectively ending his political career and opening the way for Richard Nixon's victory in the 1968 presidential election. Nixon campaigned on a platform of ending American involvement in Vietnam, a promise that resonated with voters who had watched the Sanh siege unfold on their television screens and questioned the wisdom of continuing the conflict. Military historians continue to debate the lessons of Sanh more than 5 decades after the siege ended. Some argue that the base served its purpose by tying down large numbers of North Vietnamese forces that could have been employed elsewhere, while others maintain that it was a strategic disaster that demonstrated American inability to Understand the nature of the conflict. What is beyond dispute is that Sanh marked a turning point in American strategy, forcing military leaders to abandon the conventional warfare mindset that had dominated their thinking. Since World War II, the transformation of American military doctrine following Sanh had implications that extended far beyond Vietnam. The lessons learned about the limitations of firepower and the importance of understanding enemy strategy influenced American military thinking for generations, contributing to doctrinal changes that emphasize flexibility, cultural awareness, and population-centered operations. The Siege of Sanh thus became not just a chapter in the Vietnam War, but a catalyst for fundamental changes in how the United States approached military conflicts. In the modern era, today, the site of Sanh Combat Base is a quiet memorial park maintained by the Vietnamese government, its peaceful setting offering little indication of the violence that once consumed this remote plateau. Visitors can walk among the restored bunkers and examine artifacts from the siege. But the true legacy of Sanh lies not in its physical remains, but in the strategic lessons it taught about the nature of modern warfare. The 7-to-7-day siege stands as a reminder that military success requires not just courage and firepower, but also the strategic wisdom to understand when and where to fight, and when tactical victory may actually serve the enemy's broader objectives.